In the early months of 1943, the Pacific Islands were a world unto themselves. Imagine thick vegetation, so dense that sunlight arrived only in scattered coins of gold through the canopy. The air was heavy, wet, clinging to skin like a second layer. Birds called in strange rhythms. The ground smelled of rot and growth all at once, that ancient smell of places where things live and die in quick succession. Among the twisted roots and towering palms, Japanese soldiers had learned to disappear. Not flee, mind you, but truly vanish into the landscape. They tied branches to their helmets, smeared mud across their uniforms, and climbed into the crooks of trees, sometimes 30 or 40 feet above the jungle floor. There they would wait. Hours. Days sometimes. Perfectly still. Barely breathing. These were the snipers. Men trained in patience as much as marksmanship. They had learned their craft in Manchuria, in China, in places where warfare moved slowly and carefully. They understood that a single well-placed shot could paralyze an entire unit, could make soldiers afraid to move, afraid to sleep, afraid to stand upright even for a moment. American Marines landing on these islands, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, later Peleliu and Saipan, quickly learned this fear. A man might be walking, laughing even, and then simply fall. No warning. No sound of the shot until after. The snipers used Type 38 rifles, long-barreled and accurate, firing a relatively small round that made less noise than American weapons. They became ghosts in the green. Invisible. Untouchable. Or so it seemed. The Marines, exhausted and frustrated, began searching for solutions. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you counter a threat that strikes from nowhere and vanishes just as quickly? At night, around their makeshift camps, you could hear the low murmur of men discussing tactics, comparing notes, sharing stories of near misses and friends lost to invisible bullets. The jungle itself seemed complicit, rustling at night with sounds that might be wind, might be animals, might be movement. Every shadow became suspect. Every unusual bird call. The snipers had turned the landscape itself into a weapon, and the Americans needed an answer. They needed something that could reach up into those trees, something that could sweep large areas, something that didn't require perfect aim because it simply covered everything in its path. They needed not just firepower, but the right kind of firepower. And so, from the rear echelons, from the supply ships and motor pools, came a weapon that would change the mathematics of jungle warfare. Not elegant. Not subtle. But devastatingly, terrifyingly effective. And in the distance, barely audible yet, the sound of engines, the grinding of gears, something heavy being moved into position. Picture, if you will, a mechanical assembly. 4 gun barrels, each one half an inch in diameter, 50 caliber in the old measurement, arranged in a square pattern. Each barrel longer than a man's arm, made of hardened steel, designed to fire rounds the size of a finger. Not pointed at aircraft anymore, though that had been the original purpose, but leveled. Horizontal. Aimed into the trees. This was the M45 Maxim mount, or as the soldiers simply called it, the Quad .50. For Browning M2 machine guns, linked together, mounted on the back of a half-track vehicle. A single soldier sat behind them in a small metal seat, hands on the twin grips, thumbs resting on the butterfly trigger. When that trigger was pressed, all 4 guns fired together. The sound, the sound. That's what we need to understand tonight, because the sound was almost more important than the bullets themselves. Imagine a drum roll, but deeper. Heavier. Each gun firing so rapidly that individual shots blurred into a continuous roar. Now multiply that by 4. The guns didn't fire in perfect synchronization. There was a slight offset, a rhythmic stagger, which created a peculiar oscillating thunder. A sound that carried for miles. A sound that shook the air itself. Each weapon could fire 500 rounds per minute. 4 weapons meant 2,000 rounds per minute. 33 bullets every single second, each one capable of punching through an engine block, each one capable of splintering a tree trunk, each one traveling faster than sound. But the Quad .50 wasn't designed for precision. It was designed for suppression. For area denial. For making entire sections of jungle uninhabitable. The bullets didn't need to hit the sniper directly, though they certainly could. They could shred the tree the sniper was hiding in. They could destroy the branch he was standing on. They could fill the air around him with such violence that survival became a matter of pure chance. The Marines learned to use them strategically. When a sniper was suspected in a particular area, a tree line, a ridge, a dense thicket, the Quad .50 would be positioned. Sometimes they knew roughly where the enemy was. Sometimes they were just guessing. It didn't always matter. The tactic became, spray the area. Sweep the barrels slowly back and forth. Turn 500 square feet of jungle into splinters and leave confetti. The soldiers who operated these weapons often wore earplugs, or stuffed cotton in their ears, because the noise was physically painful at close range. It rattled teeth. It made conversation impossible. After a sustained burst, there would be silence for a moment, and then the ringing would begin, that high-pitched whine that lasted for hours. But for the Japanese snipers, hidden somewhere in that targeted area, the sound meant something entirely different. It meant they had been found. Not precisely, perhaps, but found enough. It meant that in seconds their world was about to become a storm of steel. And across the island, in the morning air, you could hear it starting, that distinctive rhythm, growing louder, closer. There is something uniquely terrifying about a sound you cannot escape. The human mind, that ancient instrument of survival, is finely tuned to auditory threats. We hear danger before we see it. A crack of a twig. A growl in the dark. A change in the wind. These sounds trigger responses older than language, older than civilization itself. For the Japanese snipers, the sound of the Quad .50 became a harbinger. Not immediate death, necessarily, but the promise of it. The inevitability of it. When that oscillating roar began, distance became impossible to judge. Sound bounced through the jungle in strange ways, reflecting off trees, absorbed by leaves, distorted by humidity. The guns might be 50 yards away or 500. A sniper couldn't know. He could only hear it getting louder. And there was nowhere to run. This was the terrible mathematics of the situation. A sniper in a tree had chosen his position carefully. He had tied himself in place, sometimes literally, with rope or canvas straps, so he wouldn't fall during long periods of stillness. His rifle was positioned. His sight lines were established. His camouflage was integrated with the tree itself. But all of that preparation became a trap when the Quad .50 found his general location. To climb down required time, 30 seconds, a minute, maybe more depending on the height. To climb down required movement, which would give away his position even more precisely. And every second spent climbing was a second closer to that wall of bullets. Some snipers tried to press themselves against the far side of their tree, hoping the trunk would provide cover. Sometimes it worked. Large trees, ironwoods and banyans with trunks 3 feet thick, could absorb frightening amounts of punishment. But the .50 caliber rounds were designed to defeat light armor. They could penetrate steel. Wood, even dense tropical hardwood, was only a temporary obstacle. Others tried to remain absolutely motionless, hoping the fire would sweep past them, hoping they were in a dead zone, an angle the gunner couldn't reach. Sometimes this worked too. The jungle was three-dimensional, complex, full of shadows and folds. Not every burst found its target. But the psychological effect was universal. Every sniper who heard that sound and survived learned fear. It was a different kind of fear than combat usually provided. Most warfare is immediate. You see the enemy sees you, action and reaction happen in seconds. But the Quad .50 created a prolonged dread. You heard it coming. You heard it getting closer. You had time to imagine what it would do, time to feel your heart hammering, time to second-guess your position, your choices, your strategy. In their training, Japanese soldiers had been taught to embrace death, to see honor in sacrifice, to remain calm in the face of danger. But training prepares the mind for known threats. The Quad .50 was something new. Something mechanical and inhuman. It didn't aim so much as erase. It didn't hunt so much as delete entire spaces from the landscape. Reports from captured documents and post-war interviews revealed that Japanese commanders began warning their snipers specifically about this weapon. They called it the Sky Ripper, in some translations, the Forest Shredder, in others. The specific Japanese terms are lost to context now, but the meaning was clear: avoid it. When you hear it, retreat immediately if possible. It is not a challenge to be met. It is a force to be evaded. And somewhere, in the green shadows, a soldier listened, and understood what the sound meant, and began to climb down. Let us consider, for a moment, the physics of the thing. Not in any technical way that would disturb our rest, but simply to understand what was happening in those jungles. When the trigger was pressed, 4 separate actions began simultaneously. Inside each Browning M2, a complex dance of springs and bolts and carefully timed mechanisms started moving. Each cartridge was enormous by infantry standards. The brass casing alone was as long as a man's palm. The bullet itself, more properly called a projectile, weighed between 40 and 60 grams depending on the type. Some were armor-piercing, with hardened steel cores. Some were incendiary, designed to burn on impact. Some were tracer rounds, leaving a visible line of fire through the air so the gunner could adjust his aim. When the powder ignited, the pressure inside the chamber reached tens of thousands of pounds per square inch. The bullet accelerated down the barrel in a fraction of a second, emerging at speeds approaching 3,000 feet per second. At that velocity, the bullet didn't push through obstacles so much as smash them at a molecular level. Wood fibers didn't bend, they exploded into splinters. Metal didn't dent, it tore. Now multiply this by 33. Every single second. Imagine standing in a field and having 33 baseballs thrown at you per second, each one traveling faster than any pitch ever thrown, each one capable of going through multiple objects before stopping. That was the volume of fire we're discussing. Except instead of baseballs, these were hardened steel penetrators. The effect on vegetation was catastrophic and strangely beautiful in a terrible way. Witnesses described entire trees seeming to dissolve, as if they were made of paper instead of wood. Branches didn't break cleanly, they shattered into clouds of fiber. Leaves didn't fall, they simply ceased to exist, turned into green mist. A sustained burst of 10 seconds could reduce a 30-foot section of jungle to a wasteland of stumps and kindling. For a man caught in that field of fire, the mathematics were even more grim. The human body, for all its complexity and resilience, is fundamentally vulnerable to kinetic energy. A single .50 caliber round striking center mass would create a wound channel larger than a fist. The hydrostatic shock, the pressure wave traveling through tissue, could cause damage far from the actual bullet path. Organs could rupture from near misses. But again, it wasn't really about hitting the target directly. The weapon's true genius was in creating a zone where survival became probabilistic. If 2,000 rounds were fired into an area over the course of a minute, and that area was the size of a few tennis courts, then the space became statistically lethal. You couldn't dodge individual bullets. They were too fast, too numerous. You could only hope you were in the small percentage of space the bullets didn't occupy. The crews who operated these weapons understood this instinctively, even if they never thought about it in mathematical terms. They learned to sweep the barrels in slow, methodical patterns. Low to high. Left to right. Overlapping fields of fire. They weren't trying to snipe the sniper. They were trying to eliminate the possibility of the sniper's existence in that space. And it worked. it worked with brutal efficiency. After the first few encounters with Quad .50s, Japanese sniper tactics began to change across the theater. They pulled back from the most forward positions. They chose different trees, different angles. They became more cautious. And the guns, having spoken their piece, would fall silent, smoke drifting from the barrels, the jungle quiet except for the settling of debris. After the firing stopped, a strange stillness would descend. The human ear, so recently assaulted by that mechanical thunder, would struggle to readjust. Everything seemed muffled, distant, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton. The Marines near the weapon would shake their heads, trying to clear the ringing, speaking to each other in exaggerated movements because they couldn't hear their own voices properly yet. But gradually, other sounds would return. The ever-present buzz of insects, which had paused during the firing, would resume. Birds, if any remained in the area, would begin calling again, tentative at first. The jungle, which had seemed to hold its breath, would slowly exhale and return to its eternal business of growth and decay. The men would climb down from the half-track, or emerge from their covered positions, and begin the next phase, checking the target area. This was always approached with caution, even after such overwhelming firepower. The Pacific War had taught everyone that assumptions were dangerous. Just because a position had been thoroughly worked over didn't mean it was safe. They would walk forward in spread formation, weapons ready, eyes scanning the transformed landscape. What had been dense vegetation would now be a tangle of splintered wood and shredded leaves. Tree trunks would be pockmarked with deep gouges, showing pale wood beneath dark bark. Some trees would be leaning at impossible angles, their structural integrity simply erased by concentrated fire. Sometimes they found bodies. Sometimes they found evidence of hasty retreat, abandoned equipment, blood trails, disturbed earth where someone had fallen and crawled away. Sometimes they found nothing at all, and had to assume the target had escaped or never existed in the first place. The jungle was good at swallowing secrets, good at hiding the evidence of violence beneath new growth and crawling vines. But the important thing, the thing that changed the tactical situation, was that the sniper problem had been addressed. Not eliminated entirely. That would have required clearing every tree on every island, an impossible task. But addressed. Made manageable. The cost-benefit calculation that governed all military decisions had shifted. A Japanese sniper who might have claimed a dozen lives before being located could now be countered, could be forced to relocate, could be made to feel vulnerable in his previously safe perch. And word spread. This is important to understand. In the strange ecology of warfare, information flows in unexpected ways. Soldiers talk to other soldiers. Officers brief other officers. Prisoners, when taken, share what they know in exchange for better treatment, or simply from exhaustion and the human need to talk. Intelligence officers compile reports. Patterns emerge. By mid-1944, Japanese tactical manuals were being revised to account for American anti-sniper tactics. Recommendations changed. Snipers were advised to choose positions with multiple escape routes. They were told to limit their time in any single location. They were specifically warned about the characteristic sound of the Quad .50 and instructed to retreat immediately upon hearing it, before it could zero in on their location. This was psychological victory as much as tactical. The Americans had taken one of their opponent's most effective weapons, the invisible, patient sniper, and made it vulnerable. They had introduced uncertainty into what had been a position of perfect concealment. They had made the hunter feel hunted. And all of it hinged on that sound. That particular oscillating thunder that carried through the jungle and announced, "We know you're here, and we have the means to end you." The afternoon light slanted through the broken canopy, dust motes drifting in the beams, settling onto torn leaves and shattered wood. Let us think for a while about the soldiers who operated these weapons. Young men, most of them, in their late teens or early 20s. They came from everywhere, farms in Iowa, factories in Michigan, fishing villages in Maine, cattle ranches in Texas. The draft and enlistment had pulled them from their ordinary lives and deposited them here, in these alien islands, half a world away from anything familiar. Operating the Quad .50 was considered a specialized role, but not a particularly prestigious one. Not like being a pilot or a demolitions expert, or even a regular infantryman. It was, in some ways, considered mechanical work. You sat behind the gun, you pointed it where you were told to point it, you pressed the trigger when ordered. The weapon did the rest. But the men who did this work understood its importance. They saw the difference it made. They watched their fellow Marines move more freely through contested areas after a Quad .50 had cleared a tree line. They heard fewer reports of sniper casualties in sectors where the weapon was actively employed. They knew, in the practical way soldiers know things, that they were saving lives. The work was physically demanding in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The weapon itself was heavy, mounted on a substantial pedestal that could rotate and elevate. Moving it required strength. The ammunition came in belts or large boxes, each one weighing 30 or 40 pounds when full. A sustained engagement could go through hundreds of rounds, which meant constant loading, constant feeding of the hungry mechanism. And there was the heat. The barrels, after prolonged firing, would glow faintly red in dim light. The air around them would shimmer. Touching them, even accidentally, meant severe burns. The crews learned to work around this heat, learned the timing of the weapon's cooling cycle, learned when they could push it, and when they needed to let it rest or risk mechanical failure. There was also a strange intimacy in the work. You couldn't see your enemy, not usually. You fired into spaces, into suspected locations, into reports and coordinates. But sometimes, afterward, you would see the evidence. The destroyed position. The abandoned rifle. Sometimes the body. And then it became real in a different way. The mechanical work became personal. The abstract tactical decision became a human consequence. Some men struggled with this. Not from conscience exactly. They understood they were in a war, understood that the enemy would kill them without hesitation, but from the indirectness of it. At least the rifleman saw who he was shooting at. At least there was a moment of mutual recognition, of human meeting human in the contest. The Quad .50 denied even that. It was industrial, impersonal, efficient. Other men found comfort in exactly that distance. They could focus on the technical aspects, the mechanical reliability, the satisfaction of a weapons system functioning properly. They could think of it as problem-solving rather than killing. There was a tree line with hostiles. Now there is a cleared tree line. Problem solved. Most, probably, felt some mixture of both. They did their job because it needed doing, because their friends depended on them, because the alternative was to be the ones being shot at from invisible positions. They maintained their weapons meticulously, keeping the mechanisms clean despite the jungle's constant assault of moisture and grit. They took professional pride in their accuracy, their speed, their reliability. And at night, when the work was done and they could rest, they would write letters home, carefully editing out the parts that would worry their mothers or wives, carefully describing the islands as more beautiful and less dangerous than they were. The evening began to settle in, the heat of the day giving way to tropical twilight. Somewhere a gecko called repeatedly, endlessly, into the growing dark. To truly understand why the Quad .50 was so effective against Japanese snipers, we must step back and consider the broader context of how different military cultures approached warfare in the Pacific. This is important because weapons are not merely objects, they are expressions of philosophy, of how a nation thinks about conflict and victory. The Japanese military in the Second World War was deeply influenced by concepts of honor, individual skill, and the spiritual dimension of combat. Snipers were not just shooters, they were exemplars of Bushido adapted to modern warfare. Patience, discipline, self-denial, precision, These were virtues that connected the sniper's work to older samurai traditions. A sniper who waited 3 days for a single perfect shot was not wasting time, he was demonstrating mastery. This approach produced extraordinarily effective individual soldiers. Japanese snipers, on average, were probably among the finest marksmen in any military force of that era. Their training was rigorous, their dedication complete. They saw their role not merely as tactical but as spiritual. To be a sniper was to be a warrior in the truest sense, relying on personal skill rather than overwhelming force. The American military culture was different. Not better or worse in any absolute sense, but different in its assumptions and methods. American warfare was industrial in character. It emphasized logistics, mass production, standardization, and the application of overwhelming material superiority. Where the Japanese valued the perfect shot, Americans valued sufficient shots. Where the Japanese honored individual mastery, Americans honored systematic solutions. The Quad .50 was quintessentially American in this sense. It was not elegant. It was not refined. It did not require years of training to operate effectively. What it required was industrial capacity, the ability to manufacture the guns, produce the ammunition, transport it across the Pacific, and maintain it in harsh conditions. These were things the American economy could do better than any other nation on Earth at that time. There was also a psychological dimension to this cultural difference. For a Japanese sniper, being targeted by a Quad .50 represented a kind of insult to the entire premise of his role. He had spent months or years developing his skill, had proven himself worthy of the rifle and the mission. He represented quality. The Quad .50 represented quantity. It said, in effect, your skill is irrelevant, your dedication is meaningless, we will simply erase the space you occupy. This was demoralizing in a way that went beyond immediate tactical concerns. It challenged the conceptual framework that gave meaning to the sniper's work. If sufficient firepower could negate skill, if industrial might could overwhelm personal mastery, then what did the values of Bushido offer in this modern war? It was an existential question as much as a military one. Of course, individual soldiers rarely articulated these thoughts in such abstract terms. They were concerned with survival, with completing their missions, with protecting their comrades. But the feelings were there nonetheless, beneath the surface. The sense that the war they had been prepared to fight, a war of spirit and discipline, was being replaced by something colder and more mechanical. And this brings us to an uncomfortable truth about warfare: it is not always won by the most skilled or the most dedicated. Often, it is won by the most systematic, the most organized, the most capable of bringing resources to bear. The Quad .50 was a perfect example of this principle. It took a problem, the highly skilled, deeply concealed enemy sniper, and solved it not with greater skill but with greater force. This was not the only example in the Pacific War, of course. The same principle applied to American air superiority, naval dominance, artillery support. But the Quad .50 perhaps illustrated it most clearly because the contrast was so stark. And the night fully arrived, stars beginning to appear in the gaps between clouds, the jungle settling into its nocturnal rhythms. As 1944 progressed into 1945, and the American advance pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the nature of the fighting changed. The islands became more heavily defended, the opposition more desperate. Japanese forces, knowing they were retreating toward their final positions, began fighting with even greater determination. And their tactics continued to evolve in response to American weapons and methods. Snipers became more mobile, abandoning the strategy of holding a single position for extended periods. Instead, they would take a few shots, maybe just one, and then immediately relocate. This made them harder to find with the Quad .50, though not impossible. The American response was to simply increase the number of weapons available, and the speed with which they could be brought to bear. Half-tracks carrying quad .50s began moving closer to the front lines, sometimes even participating in initial assaults. This was dangerous. The vehicles were not heavily armored, and a well-placed grenade or mortar round could destroy the weapon and kill its crew. But the tactical value was considered worth the risk. Having immediate fire support available to counter snipers meant infantry could advance more confidently and rapidly. There were also adaptations in how the weapon was employed. Gunners learned to use tracer rounds more effectively, watching the visible path of their fire and adjusting in real time. They developed techniques for walking their fire up tree trunks, starting at the base and gradually elevating the aim, systematically destroying the tree from bottom to top. This method proved particularly effective because it didn't require knowing exactly where in the tree the sniper was hiding, it simply eliminated the tree itself. Intelligence gathering improved as well. Marines became better at identifying likely sniper positions before they were occupied. Certain types of trees were favored, ones with good sight lines and concealment. Certain terrain features were predictable. As the Americans gained experience in jungle fighting, they developed an intuition for where to look and, more importantly, where to direct preemptive fire. The doctrine of reconnaissance by fire became standard in many units. Rather than waiting for a sniper to reveal himself by shooting, patrols would simply have a quad .50 sweep suspected areas before advancing. This used enormous amounts of ammunition, thousands of rounds sometimes for 0 confirmed kills, but it saved lives and kept the initiative with the attackers. Japanese commanders tried various counters. They dispersed their snipers more widely, reasoning that fewer targets would be harder to find. They placed snipers in unexpected locations, in buildings, in caves, on hillsides rather than in trees. They even tried using the sound of the quad .50 to their advantage, having snipers position themselves where they could fire on the weapon crews while they were focused on other targets. These adaptations had some success. The Americans never completely solved the sniper problem. Even in the final months of the war, Japanese snipers continued to claim lives, continued to slow advances, continued to require constant vigilance. But the quad .50 and other American anti-sniper tactics had fundamentally shifted the balance. What had been one of Japan's most effective defensive weapons had been rendered far less decisive. There was also an economic dimension to this evolution. Every .50 caliber round cost money to produce, transport, and deliver. In a longer war, or a war fought by a less wealthy nation, this kind of ammunition expenditure might have been unsustainable. But American industrial capacity was so vast that ammunition shortages were rarely a limiting factor in tactical decisions. The phrase, "dollar for dollar, life for life," captures the calculation, better to expend material resources than human ones. And in the historical record, the decisions were made, the orders given, the weapons deployed, one small thread in the vast tapestry of conflict. History, when written carefully, tends toward the general and the statistical. We speak of divisions and casualties, of strategies and outcomes. But history is lived individually, in singular moments, by people with names and faces and families waiting somewhere far away. Let us consider a few such moments, reconstructed from unit records and memoirs and the scattered evidence that survives. There was a Marine corporal from Oregon, whose name has been lost but whose action was recorded in a combat report from Peleliu. His squad had been pinned down for hours by a sniper they couldn't locate. 2 men had been wounded trying to move. The corporal called up a half-track with a quad .50. He stood exposed, drawing fire to mark the direction for the gunner. The sniper shot at him 3 times, missed all 3. The quad .50 fired a sustained burst into the suspected tree. When the squad moved forward, they found the sniper's body in the branches, still tied in place, rifle dropped somewhere in the underbrush below. There was a Japanese soldier, whose diary was recovered after the Battle of Saipan. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, had been conscripted in 1943, had trained as a sniper because he had scored well in rifle practice. In his last entries, written in the small careful characters of classical Japanese, he described the fear of the American sky guns. He wrote that he prayed to be killed in combat rather than to die from such a weapon, because death from the sky guns was not honorable, was not personal, felt like being swept away by a tsunami rather than defeated by a warrior. There was an American sergeant, interviewed after the war, who operated a quad .50 through campaigns in the Solomons, the Philippines, and finally Okinawa. He said the hardest part was never knowing if you'd actually hit anything. You'd fire into the jungle, and maybe something would happen, maybe nothing. Sometimes you'd hear stories later about how your fire had taken out a sniper position, but usually you just moved to the next position and did it again. He said he thought about it sometimes, wondered if the Japanese soldiers he'd fired at had families, had reasons for being there just like he did. But mostly he tried not to think about it at all. There were countless such moments, of course. Thousands of individual encounters, each one unique, each one meaning everything to the people involved and almost nothing to the larger strategic picture. A machine gun firing into trees. A soldier trying to hide. The probability of metal finding flesh in three-dimensional space. Simple physics multiplied by human context equals tragedy, equals survival, equals history. Some of these stories ended with the sniper escaping, climbing down under cover of the jungle's complexity, living to snipe another day. Some ended with the Marine Patrol moving on, never knowing if their fire had been effective, adding another uncertain data point to the war's vast ledger. Some ended with discovery, the body in the tree, the dropped weapon, the confirmation that this particular threat had been neutralized. And in each case, the men involved went on, those who survived went on, to other battles, other islands, eventually to the war's end and the strange business of returning to civilian life. They carried these moments with them in ways both obvious and subtle. Some had nightmares. Some had nothing but relief. Some felt guilt for surviving when others hadn't. Some felt pride in having done their duty. Most felt some complicated mixture of all of these things, which they learned not to talk about because the words never quite captured it anyway. The decades passed, the jungle reclaimed its islands, trees grew where trees had fallen, the earth patient and endlessly forgiving. Today, if you visit the Pacific Islands where these battles took place, you will find them mostly at peace. The jungles have recovered, have swallowed most evidence of the fighting. The trees are whole again, generations removed from the ones that were splintered. The ground is soft with accumulated leaves and life. Birds nest where machine guns once fired. The islands have returned to their own rhythms, their own purposes. But traces remain, if you know where to look. Rusted metal, half buried in root systems. Fragments of equipment that weren't worth recovering. Occasionally, unexploded ordnance, still dangerous after 80 years, a reminder that some violence echoes forward longer than others. Local communities, descended from those who witnessed the fighting or participated in it, maintain small memorials. Names on stone. Flowers replaced each year. The quad .50 itself lived on beyond the Pacific War. The basic weapon system proved so effective that it was used in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts continuing into the 21st century. The specific tactics evolved, but the underlying principle remained: concentrated automatic fire can solve problems that precision cannot. Later versions were mounted on ships, on fortified positions, eventually on more modern vehicles. But the sound, that distinctive oscillating thunder, remained recognizable to anyone who had heard it before. In military academies and training centers, the Pacific War's sniper-counter-sniper evolution is still studied. Not because future wars will look exactly like past ones, they never do, but because the underlying principles remain relevant. How do you counter an enemy's strength? How do you apply your own advantages? How do you adapt when your tactics stop working? These are eternal questions in warfare, answered differently in each generation but always present. For the soldiers who were there, both American and Japanese, the memories persisted in different ways. Some spoke about their experiences freely, wrote memoirs, gave interviews to historians. Others remained silent, preferring to keep those years private, separate from the lives they built afterward. Both responses were valid. Neither was more correct than the other. Memory is personal, and each person processes trauma and survival in their own way. The broader lesson, perhaps, is about the nature of technological warfare. The Quad .50 represented a moment when industrial capacity became decisive in a way that individual skill and courage could not overcome. This was not the first such moment in history. Artillery, machine guns, even firearms themselves had represented similar shifts, but it was a clear example. The warrior tradition, the idea that superior training and dedication could triumph over material disadvantage, ran headlong into a reality where material advantage simply couldn't be overcome by anything else. This didn't make the Japanese snipers any less brave or skilled. It didn't make the American gunners any less endangered or their work any less important. It simply was a fact of that particular war, in that particular time. Both sides did what they thought they must, what they were ordered to do, what their training and culture had prepared them for. And now, decades later, we can look back with the sad clarity that distance provides. We can see the humanity on both sides. We can acknowledge the complexity, the mixed motives, the simple desire of most soldiers to survive and go home. We can honor sacrifice without glorifying war. We can study history without pretending it was simpler than it was. And so our story closes. As the night deep, and the world continues its patient turning, may you find rest in this knowledge. May you sleep knowing that even the darkest chapters eventually give way to peace.